In this video, you are about to hear a story that most Americans have never been told. It is a story of a Polish soldier trapped between two totalitarian empires who was dragged into the heart of the Soviet system of slave labor, walks through fields of mines and barbed wire, and finally reaches the free world just as the United States is stepping into its role as the most technologically advanced power on Earth. His name is Waldemar, and through his eyes, you will see both the forgotten terror of Soviet camps and the shocking contrast of American strength and innovation that left Soviet officials stunned. Waldemar was born in the eastern regions of Poland, in a country that believed its greatest threat came from Nazi Germany. Like many young men of his generation, he grew up hearing about American factories, American cars, and American movies, symbols of a distant world where technology and freedom seemed to move together. When war broke out in September 1939 and Germany invaded from the west, Waldemar put on a Polish uniform, not knowing that a second enemy was already on the move. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, cutting Poland in half and sealing the fate of hundreds of thousands of its citizens. In the chaos of that double invasion, Waldemar's unit was surrounded by Soviet forces. He expected to be treated as a prisoner of war, in accordance with civilized rules he had heard about from Western armies. Instead, he was marched to a makeshift NKVD collection point, interrogated as a class enemy, and told nothing about his legal status. For the Soviets, he was not a soldier to be respected, but a problem to be removed, a man to be turned into a laboring body, a number in a file. In a matter of days, Waldemar was stripped of his rank, his documents, and eventually of his freedom of movement. In the winter night of February 1940, the knock came. For many Polish families in the Eastern Territories, it came at around 2 or 3 in the morning, when resistance was least likely. NKVD officers and local collaborators entered homes, read out hurried lists of names, and ordered people to pack whatever they could carry in minutes. Waldemar, already on Soviet lists as a dangerous element, was taken from the house where he had been hiding after the collapse of his unit. Along with civilians, women, children, and the elderly, he was driven to a train station, pushed into a wooden freight car, and locked inside. The journey east would last days, sometimes weeks. There were no seats, no beds, only straw on the floor and a hole in the corner of the wagon serving as a toilet. Food was scarce. Water was sometimes just snow pushed through a small opening in the wall. In winter, temperatures inside those cars dropped well below freezing. People burned anything they could, bits of luggage, pieces of wooden planks, to try to keep children alive. By 1941, it is estimated that well over 1 million Polish citizens had been moved into labor sites and exile settlements across the Soviet Union in transports like these. Waldemar watched as an old man stopped moving and froze sitting up, his eyes open, staring at nothing. The guards removed the body like a sack. The train did not stop. When the doors finally opened, Waldemar was somewhere in the vastness of the Soviet East, Siberia, or perhaps northern Kazakhstan, where Poles were sent in large numbers. The landscape was brutal, endless forests, swamps, or steppe, under a sky that seemed to press down like a lid. The camp itself was a cluster of wooden barracks surrounded by fences of barbed wire, guard towers at the corners, and a perimeter beyond which few ever returned. Here, the Soviet state expected him to disappear, into the snow, into the statistics, into the silence. Life in the camp began before dawn. Guards kicked open barrack doors, shouted orders, and counted prisoners while bitter wind rushed inside. Waldemar's first assignment was to cut trees in a logging area miles from the camp. The workday could last 10 to 12 hours, with an axe or a saw so dull that every cut felt like a battle. Prisoners who failed to meet quotas were punished with reduced rations, isolation cells, or worse. Food was black bread, watery soup, sometimes a thin porridge. It was just enough to keep a human being walking, but not enough to keep him strong. The camp was a society built on hunger. Hunger for food, hunger for warmth, hunger for a way out. Waldemar saw men chew frozen horse meat with broken teeth, and women trade the last family heirlooms for a crust of bread. Every day, the roll call would end with questions like, "Who was missing?" The missing were often gone forever, swallowed by disease, exhaustion, or the bullets of guards. In some camps, mortality in certain periods reached catastrophic levels as disease and malnutrition spread through overcrowded barracks. Yet, even in this world, there were sparks of human dignity. In one barrack, Waldemar met a Polish teacher who whispered lessons at night, teaching others basic Russian so they could understand orders and avoid fatal misunderstandings. Another prisoner, a former doctor, used scraps of cloth and boiling water to treat frostbite and infections, a fragile line between life and death. There were also songs, quiet, half-forgotten melodies hummed in Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, reminders that each prisoner carried a world inside them that the Soviet system could not fully erase. Waldemar learned the rhythms of the camp. He studied the habits of the guards, the timing of patrols, the direction of searchlights sweeping the snow. He learned which guards were cruel for pleasure and which enforced rules mechanically but might ignore a small infraction. He also heard rumors that somewhere far away the war had taken a new turn, that Germany had attacked the Soviet Union in 1941, and that political winds might be shifting. Stories floated through the barracks about an amnesty for Polish citizens, about a possibility to form a Polish army on Soviet soil and escape through Iran. For many, these were just rumors. For Waldemar, they became a thin line of hope. The reality was that some Poles were indeed released after the so-called amnesty of 1941, allowed to join the Polish forces under General Anders, which later evacuated through Central Asia to Iran. But the system was chaotic, and many records were incomplete or manipulated. Some people who should have been released were forgotten or deliberately kept in camps. There is every reason to believe that someone like Waldemar, with a soldier's background and an undesirable profile, could have been among those left behind, categorized as too dangerous to free, yet not important enough to execute. As winter returned, one winter blending into the next, Waldemar realized that waiting for Moscow's mercy was another form of death. The Soviet state depended on secrecy, fear, and the impossibility of escape. To break that cycle, someone had to walk out. But walking out meant crossing not just fences and forests, but zones of mined ground, hostile terrain, and political borders where every uniformed man carried orders to shoot. The perimeter of many camps and frontier regions in the USSR was protected not just by fence and watchtower, but by specially designed security zones. Some were simple, cleared strips of land where footprints showed clearly. Others were seeded with mines, turning open ground into an invisible field of death. Guards had dogs, flares, and rifles. They also had a clear instruction. Escape attempts were dealt with swiftly and violently. Waldemar began to plan. His plan was not written on paper. Writing meant evidence, and evidence meant punishment. Instead, he collected information in his memory. He watched where guards walked freely beyond the main fence. He noticed that supply trucks followed the same tracks through the woods without ever exploding. He observed the direction of the wind, the times when blowing snow reduced visibility, and the stretches of the perimeter where searchlights overlapped poorly. For months, these observations became his secret map. The opportunity came on a night when the sky was thick with storm clouds and the air was heavy with snow. The camp was quieter than usual. Even the guards seemed more interested in shelter than in patrolling the far corners of the fence. Waldemar had spent days saving crumbs of bread from his ration, wrapping them in cloth, and hiding them under a loose floorboard. Now he tied them to his body under his threadbare coat. He wore every layer he had, 2 shirts, a patched sweater, and a scarf that barely counted as one. He moved first to the latrine, a common place to slip into the darkness beyond the barracks. From there, he crawled, not walked, across the packed snow, keeping his body low, feeling the cold rise from the ground into his bones. The searchlights from the guard towers swung in predictable arcs, like slow metronomes of danger. He paused in every patch of shadow, willing his heart to beat more quietly. A bark echoed in the distance, then faded. Every sound sounded louder in his ears, the crunch of snow, the whisper of fabric, the tiny clink of metal buttons. Reaching the fence, Waldemar slid his body against the frozen posts. The barbed wire above had been patched so many times that some segments sagged close to the ground. He knew that touching the wrong spot could tangle him and cost him precious seconds, enough for a guard to spot him and fire. Carefully, he pushed his body through, letting the barbs scratch his clothes and skin, but not catch fully. A piece of his sleeve tore with a soft ripping sound. He froze, waiting. No shout, no shot. Beyond the fence, the real danger began. The initial zone beyond many Soviet high-security perimeters was often patrolled or contained obstacles. In some regions, mines were laid in irregular patterns to create fear and unpredictability. Waldemar had watched where guards stepped. He had memorized a narrow corridor where patrols walked every day. Now he placed his feet with excruciating care into the shallow impressions left by boots, barely visible under the new snow. The air seemed to hold its breath with him. Halfway through that deadly zone, he heard a noise behind him, a dull thump, then a sharp crack, then a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite an explosion, but both. For a second, the night lit up with a flash. Someone else had tried to follow, stepping off the invisible path. Shouts erupted from the direction of the camp. A searchlight swung wildly across the open ground, then another. Waldemar threw himself flat, pressing his face into the snow, heart pounding loud enough, he thought, to set off another mine. For long minutes, the searchlights probed the white emptiness. Guards shouted to each other. A flare shot into the sky, painting the world in harsh, temporary daylight. But the storm had intensified, snow falling thick between the beams of light. The body of the man who had exploded lay twisted near the edge of the field. After a tense period, the guards pulled back, deciding that the blown body was proof enough that the escape attempt had failed. They did not realize that another shadow lay motionless, just beyond their circle of certainty. When the lights finally retreated and the flare's glow faded, Waldemar began to move again. Inch by inch, step by step, he followed the ghost of the patrol path until he reached the safety of dense trees. Only there, hidden under the branches heavy with snow, did he allow himself to breathe fully. He had escaped the camp, but he was still inside the Soviet Union, still deep in a country where every border post, every village official, every policeman was part of the machine he had just defied. The next weeks turned into a journey of survival that would carry him across forests, frozen rivers, and hostile frontiers. His goal was not simply to run in any direction, but to move south and west, toward regions where he had heard Polish forces and civilians were gathering, where Allied contacts might exist, and where the long arm of Moscow was weaker. For some Poles, this meant trying to reach Central Asia and then Iran, where the Polish army under General Anders was evacuating. For others, it meant aiming for the border regions near the Middle East or Central Europe. Waldemar had no map, but he had a sense of the heavens and the habits of rivers. He traveled at night, using the stars as guides when clouds allowed. During the day, he hid in thickets or abandoned sheds, conserving energy and avoiding roads. Cold gnawed at him constantly. Frostbite threatened his fingers and toes, turning them numb, then burning with pain. He rationed crumbs of bread and the occasional stolen potato with the precision of a scientist. Every calorie was a weapon in his personal war against freezing and collapse. In one remote village, he approached a house only after watching it for hours from the tree line. Smoke rose from the chimney, a dim light burned inside. He knew that knocking on the wrong door in Soviet territory could mean immediate arrest or being shot as a bandit. Finally, hunger forced his hand. He tapped on the wooden door softly, then harder. An elderly woman opened it a crack, eyes narrowed with suspicion. He spoke quietly, in Polish, then in broken Russian. He said he was just a traveler, a laborer lost from a work brigade. She looked at his clothes, his hollow eyes, his shaking hands. She could have closed the door and called the authorities. Instead, she pulled him inside, sat him near a stove, and placed a piece of black bread in his hand. Her own son, she haltingly explained, had been taken by the war and never returned. Maybe he was in a camp like the one Waldemar had fled. Maybe he was already dead. Helping this stranger was a small act of defiance against a system that had taken her child. This scene repeated itself, with variations, across his journey. Some doors remained closed, curtains twitching nervously as he passed. Other doors opened a little, then a little more. A man shared a bowl of cabbage soup. A child silently handed him an extra wool mitten. At the same time, danger was never far away. Once, passing through a railway station yard at night, he heard the stamping of boots and saw the silhouettes of armed guards on the platform. He melted back into the shadows before they noticed him. Another time, distant rifle shots crackled through the trees as a patrol searched for someone else who had dared to run. Eventually, after weeks of walking and hiding, Waldemar reached a landscape that felt different. Fewer pine forests, more open fields and distant mountains. Rumors among villagers spoke of a border, of another country just beyond a ridge or a river. Depending on the route you imagined for him, that border might have been towards Central Asia and Iran, or toward a southern frontier where the influence of Moscow weakened and Allied power strengthened. In either case, it represented something almost mythical, the possibility of stepping out of the Soviet world and into a space where American and British power mattered. The border itself was no simple line on a map. It was a zone of patrols, watchtowers, and, in some places, mines similar to those around the camp. Fences, searchlights, and dogs guarded not just the entrance, but the exit from the Soviet Union. For Waldemar, crossing this frontier was the final test of everything he had learned: the discipline of moving silently, the patience of waiting for the right moment, and the courage to risk death one more time for the chance of life. Choosing a cold, moonless night, he approached the border from a stretch of land where the terrain was broken and uneven, making it hard for vehicles to patrol regularly. He watched for hours, counting the interval between lights on the horizon. He moved only when the wind rose, masking the sound of his steps. At one point, he felt a wire brush against his boot and froze. He pictured a mine buried under the soil, a trigger connected to that wire. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he lifted his foot and shifted his weight away, sliding to the side. Nothing exploded. He breathed again. At last, crawling through mud and tangled brush, he passed a final line of posts and felt, in his bones more than in his mind, that something had changed. He was no longer inside the Soviet Union. Ahead of him lay a country that, while still dangerous and unstable, was connected to the Western Allies. Behind him lay camps, barbed wire, and a system that had tried to erase him. Waldemar's path from that border eventually brought him into contact with Polish units and Allied representatives. Many Poles who had escaped or been released from the USSR joined forces under General Anders and were evacuated through ports on the Caspian Sea to the Iranian city of Pahlavi in 1942. The journey from Central Asia to Iran involved trains, overcrowded ships, and yet more uncertainty. But for those who reached Iran, the first sight of the sea, of foreign ships, and of soldiers in British or other Allied uniforms felt like stepping into another world. Waldemar had spent years in the gray, brutal world of Soviet labor, where technology was mostly shovels, axes, and rifles pointed at prisoners. In Iran and later in territories closer to the Western Allies, he glimpsed a different side of the war. Trucks with powerful engines, medical units with organized equipment, radios that crackled with messages in English, and an entire logistical network working to move men and supplies across continents. For a man who had lived under a regime that used human lives as expendable fuel, the efficiency and scale of Allied operations were astonishing. In time, as the war moved toward its climax, Waldemar found himself under the wing of forces that were supplied in large part by American industry. The United States, protected by two oceans and powered by a massive industrial base, had become the workshop of democracy. Aircraft carriers, long-range bombers, cargo ships, and an endless stream of trucks, jeeps, and radios flowed out of American factories. Even through the layers of British and Polish structures, Waldemar could see the outlines of a power unlike anything the Soviet Union could match without resorting to brutal coercion. This contrast was not lost on Soviet leaders either. As the war progressed, the USSR received huge quantities of American Lend-Lease aid, trucks, locomotives, food, clothing, and raw materials. Soviet soldiers and officers saw American Studebaker trucks rolling across their roads, tasted American canned food, and used American-made equipment in the harshest theaters of war. For many of them, it was their first direct encounter with the scale and quality of American production. While official propaganda tried to downplay Western contributions, the reality on the ground was obvious. American technology and industry were reshaping the war. When the war ended and the Cold War began, this gap in technology and production would only grow more visible. American bombers, aircraft carriers, jet engines, and later nuclear weapons and ICBMs represented a level of engineering and resources that left Soviet planners both impressed and deeply anxious. The Soviet Union, for all its sacrifices and human cost, struggled to match the output of a country that had never been occupied, that had preserved its factories, and that had made mass production a science. For Waldemar, who knew the Soviet system from the inside, the emerging Cold War was not just a contest of ideologies, it was a contest of what kind of society could produce and sustain advanced technology without devouring its own people. He had seen the Soviet answer: labor camps, forced collectivization, secret police, and a hierarchy of fear. Now he observed the American answer, a noisy, sometimes chaotic democracy, but one that was powered by universities, companies, and free citizens innovating in laboratories and factories. The difference was not abstract. It was measured in the reliability of a truck engine, the precision of a radio signal, the speed of a transport plane. Years later, sitting in a small apartment far from the forests of Siberia, Waldemar would try to explain this to younger listeners. They asked him what shocked the Soviets most about the Americans. Was it the nuclear bomb, the aircraft carriers, the rockets? Waldemar would shake his head slowly. The most shocking thing, he said, was not a single weapon or a single machine. It was the realization that American power came from millions of people who did not have to be forced at gunpoint to work.
He explained how in the Gulag, the state controlled everything: where you slept, what you ate, where you walked, who lived and who died. The result was misery, waste, and constant fear. In contrast, the United States showed that a nation could reach unimaginable heights of technological power by letting its citizens think, argue, innovate, and build on their own initiative. This was something that Soviet leaders could not fully copy because it would require dismantling the very system that kept them in power. When the space race began and the world watched rockets rise into the sky, Waldemar saw it not just as a competition of engineers, but as a continuation of the contrast he had lived. The Soviet Union stunned the world by launching the first satellite and the first human into space, extraordinary achievements that relied on concentrated effort and ruthless prioritization. The United States, catching up and then surpassing those feats, landed humans on the moon using a vast, decentralized network of companies, laboratories, and universities. Behind every launch, Waldemar knew there were hidden stories like his, stories of people who had escaped one system and chosen another.
For American viewers, Waldemar's story is not simply a distant tragedy in a faraway land. It is a mirror showing what makes their own history different. While the Soviet Union chained millions to shovels and axes in frozen forests, the United States put tools in the hands of free workers and asked them to build cars, planes, radios, and computers. While the Soviet regime tried to crush independent thought in camps and prisons, American research labs encouraged competition and creativity. The result was not only a better life for citizens at home, but a strategic advantage that left Soviet leaders perpetually afraid of falling behind. When you hear about Waldemar crawling through a minefield or shivering in a barrack with nothing but a scrap of bread, remember what he saw when he finally reached the orbit of the American-led world. He saw supply lines that worked, vehicles that started even in cold weather, medical tent hospitals that saved lives instead of wasting them. He saw radios bringing news from across the globe, and later he would see televisions and computers reshaping everyday life. For a man who had lived in a system where broken tools and broken bodies were normal, this was nothing short of miraculous. Waldemar's life was marked by silence for many years. Like many survivors of camps, he struggled with whether to speak at all. Some people did not want to listen. Others preferred simple stories of allies and enemies, ignoring the complex reality that one of the main wartime allies, the Soviet Union, had also been a brutal oppressor. But as the Cold War unfolded and more testimony surfaced, it became harder to maintain the illusion that all sides were morally equal. Men and women who had walked out of Siberia, like Waldemar, served as living evidence of what the Soviet system required to survive. Today, when we look back at the Cold War, we often focus on big events: the Berlin airlift, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the arms race, the fall of the Berlin Wall. But behind those headlines stood people like Waldemar Lichko, whose personal journeys captured the deeper truth of the era. The Cold War was not just about missiles and tanks. It was about whether a system built on forced labor and fear could truly compete with a system built on voluntary effort and technological creativity. Waldemar's escape from the Gulag, his walk through snow and mines, and his encounter with the material reality of American-led power all point in the same direction. The Soviet Union could shock the world with occasional breakthroughs and terrifying displays of strength, but it could never fully replicate what made American power enduring: a society where ordinary people, given freedom and opportunity, could build extraordinary things. As you finish this story, imagine for a moment the path that began in a crowded freight car on a freezing February night and ended decades later in a world connected by satellites and computers. Imagine the young Polish soldier, skin and bones in a Siberian camp, having no idea that across the ocean, American factories were already inventing the machines that would define the future. And imagine the shock, the fascination, even the envy felt by Soviet officials when they were forced to confront a simple, uncomfortable fact. The country they feared most used not terror, but freedom as the engine of its technological might. That is the legacy of Waldemar Lichko's journey. It is a reminder that the real strength of a nation is not measured only in its weapons, but in the way it treats its people and in what those people are free to create.